On August 19, 1953, the democratically elected Prime Minister of Iran was overthrown. Tanks rolled through Tehran. The Prime Minister's house was shelled. 300 people died in the streets. By the end of the day, a Shah was on the throne with absolute power, and a parliament was dissolved. For 60 years, the United States denied any involvement. 6 presidents repeated the same line: Iran had overthrown its own government. America had nothing to do with it. Then on August 19, 2013, exactly 60 years later, the CIA quietly released a document, 8 pages, the internal agency history of an operation called TPAJAX. The first sentence reads, "The military coup that overthrew Mosaddeq was carried out under CIA direction as an act of U.S. foreign policy." After 60 years of denial, the agency admitted it in a single sentence, and nobody in America was taught what came next. Because what came next is everything. Every American president since Eisenhower has been dealing with the consequences of one decision made in the summer of 1953. This is the story of that decision, the documents that prove it, and the man who paid for it. The official version, the one Americans heard for decades, went like this. In 1953, Iran was unstable. A radical nationalist named Mohammad Mosaddeq had seized power. He was sympathetic to communists. He was driving the country into chaos. The Iranian people themselves, supported by their young Shah, rose up and removed him. The United States, watching from a distance, was relieved. That story was repeated in State Department briefings, in textbooks, in major newspapers, for 2 generations. It was the official position of the United States government from 1953 until 2000, when Secretary of State Madeleine Albright became the first American official to publicly acknowledge, partially, what had happened. Full admission would not come until 2013. Now read the documents the CIA itself published. The lead document is called Clandestine Service History. Overthrow of Premier Mosaddeq of Iran, November 1952 to August 1953. Author Dr. Donald Wilbur, one of the operations planners. Written in 1954, declassified in 2013. 200 pages of internal record. Wilbur doesn't hedge. He writes that the operation was conceived in Washington, planned by the CIA in coordination with British intelligence, funded with American money, executed using Iranian agents on the CIA payroll. The installed government was chosen in advance. The budget for TPAJAX was about $1 million in 1953 money. That money paid for crowds, for newspaper editors, for clergy, for street gangs led by professional strongmen, for Iranian military officers, for fake communist leaflets designed to make Mosaddeq look like a Soviet puppet. The CIA created, out of nothing, the appearance of a popular uprising. The man who ran the operation on the ground was Kermit Roosevelt Jr., grandson of Theodore Roosevelt. He flew into Tehran in July 1953 on a false passport. He worked from a basement in the U.S. Embassy. He met with the Shah secretly, at night, 3 times. He paid for the mob that filled the streets on August 19th. He wrote his own memoir of it in 1979. The CIA briefly tried to suppress it because it revealed too much. The documents make the operation undeniable, but the harder question is why. The standard explanation has always been Cold War logic. Mosaddeq was drifting toward the Soviet Union. He had legalized the Tudeh, the Iranian Communist Party. He was unstable. He was a domino about to fall. Now look at what U.S. intelligence itself was saying at the time. A national intelligence estimate from November 1952 concluded that Mosaddeq was not a communist, not pro-Soviet, not likely to align with Moscow. He was a nationalist, a liberal in the old European sense, a constitutional lawyer. He distrusted both the British and the Soviets equally. The CIA's own analysts told their own government, in writing, that the communism story didn't hold up. So what was the real story? Read the British memos. In 1951, Mosaddeq had done something no leader in the Middle East had ever done. He nationalized the oil. The Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, what we now call BP, had controlled Iranian oil since 1908. The terms were extraordinary. Iran received about 16% of the profits. Britain received the rest. Iranian workers in the oil fields lived in tents, while British managers lived in air-conditioned villas. Iranian engineers were paid 1/10 of what their British counterparts made. In 1947, Iran asked to renegotiate. The British refused. In 1949, Iran asked again. The British refused. By 1951, the Iranian parliament, democratically elected, voted unanimously to nationalize the oil. Mosaddeq, the architect of the law, became prime minister. Britain responded by blockading Iranian oil exports. The Royal Navy turned away tankers. British engineers walked out of the refineries. Iran was strangled economically, and the British government, under Winston Churchill, back in power after 1951, began lobbying Washington for a coup. Truman refused. He told the British in 1952 that the United States would not participate in overthrowing a democratically elected government. The British waited. In January 1953, Eisenhower took office. The Dulles brothers, John Foster at State and Allen at the CIA, took over American foreign policy. Both brothers had spent their careers at Sullivan and Cromwell, a Wall Street law firm whose clients included major oil companies. Within weeks, they began approving what Truman had refused. The British and American intelligence services merged their planning. The operation was given a name, TPAJAX. The TP was the CIA's country code for Iran. The Ajax was the cleaning product, the joke being that they were going to clean up Iran. The men in those rooms knew what they were doing. The British memos, declassified later, are explicit. The concern was not communism. The concern was that if Mosaddeq succeeded in nationalizing Anglo-Iranian, other countries would follow. Venezuela, Indonesia, Saudi Arabia. The entire post-war oil order would collapse. Mosaddeq was not a domino. He was a precedent, and precedents had to be stopped. There was opposition inside the U.S. government. There always is. The American ambassador, Henry Grady, had spent 2 years arguing that Mosaddeq should be supported, not removed. Grady was reassigned. His replacement, Loy Henderson, took the opposite view. Within months of Henderson's arrival, the coup was on. Inside the CIA itself, the operation had skeptics. A station officer named Roger Gorin, chief of station in Tehran, opposed TPAJAX from the start. He warned Washington that the United States would be permanently associated, in Iranian memory, with the removal of Mosaddeq. Who was Mosaddeq? He was 70 years old in 1953, trained as a lawyer in Switzerland, one of the first Iranians to earn a doctorate in law in Europe. He had been a member of the Iranian parliament since the 1920s, jailed under the previous Shah for opposing autocracy. He was a constitutionalist. He believed in parliamentary government. He believed in the rule of law. He was independently wealthy. He could not be bribed. In 1951, Time magazine named him Man of the Year, beating Truman, MacArthur, and Eisenhower. The cover called him the Iron Man of Iran. The article described him as a strange, frail figure who often gave speeches from a hospital bed, in pajamas, because of his health. American readers in 1951 knew exactly who Mosaddeq was. He was an international celebrity. Then he disappeared from American memory almost overnight. When the coup came on August 19, 1953, Mossaddeq's house was attacked by mobs paid by the CIA, reinforced by tank fire from army units commanded by officers on the CIA payroll. He escaped over a back wall. He surrendered the next day. He was tried by a military court and sentenced to 3 years in solitary confinement. After prison, he was placed under house arrest at his estate outside Tehran. He lived there, isolated, until his death in 1967. The Shah forbade public mention of his name. When he died, the regime refused to allow a public funeral. He was buried, by order of the government, in his own living room. The grave is still there. His final words were that his only crime had been to nationalize the oil industry of his country. The man who replaced him was Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, the Shah. With the parliament dissolved and Mosaddeq erased, the Shah ruled Iran for the next 26 years as an absolute monarch. He created SAVAK, a secret police force trained in part by the CIA and the Israeli Mossad. SAVAK tortured tens of thousands of political prisoners. Estimates of those killed range from several thousand to over 15,000. The United States supported the Shah throughout. He bought tens of billions of dollars in American weapons. American oil companies, not previously holding significant Iranian concessions, were brought in alongside the British under a new consortium in 1954. American share, 40%. The British kept 40%. French and Dutch firms split the remaining 20%. Iran kept the same 50% share of profits Mosaddeq had been negotiating for in 1951. He just wasn't allowed to live to see it. In 1979, after 26 years of accumulated rage, the Iranian people overthrew the Shah. The revolution was not at first an Islamic one. It was a coalition of liberals, leftists, nationalists, and Islamists. They all remembered 1953. They all knew the United States had put the Shah on the throne. When the embassy in Tehran was seized that November, 52 Americans were taken hostage. The students who did it called the building the Den of Spies, because in 1953, that building was where Kermit Roosevelt had run the coup. The hostage crisis, the Iran-Iraq War, the rise of the clerical regime, 4 decades of mutual hostility, the sanctions, the proxy wars, the nuclear standoff. None of it makes sense without 1953. President Obama, in a speech in Cairo in 2009, did something no American president had done. He acknowledged it. He said, "In the Cold War, the United States played a role in the overthrow of a democratically elected Iranian government." That was the full extent of the official admission. One sentence in one speech. 4 years later, the CIA released the Wilbur History. The documents have been public for over a decade. They are not classified. They are not contested. They sit in the agency's online reading room. Any American can read them. Almost no one does. What if Truman had been right? What if the United States had refused, kept refusing, let Mosaddeq survive, let Iran become a functioning Middle Eastern democracy with national control over its own resources? Would there have been a 1979 revolution? A hostage crisis? An Iran-Iraq war that killed 1 million people? Would the United States be locked, today, in a confrontation with Tehran that has cost trillions of dollars? We don't know. We can't know. There was a man in Tehran in 1953 who believed in parliamentary government. He was elected. He was popular. He was Time magazine's Man of the Year. American intelligence said he was not a communist. The American ambassador said he should be supported. A CIA station chief said overthrowing him would haunt the United States for generations. He was overthrown anyway. For oil. The agency admitted it in writing. 60 years later, in a document most Americans have never read, the Iranian people remember 1953 every August. The American people, by and large, have never been told it happened. That silence, between what one country remembers and another country forgets, is the foundation everything since has been built on.